Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in Devil's Den, Arkansas's history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. Which locations and what hours of the day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. Devil's Den was little more than a group of small homesteads strewn throughout the rocky landscape of the Boston Mountains in northwest Arkansas in 1904. The settlement's name had come from the ragged rock formations that, when the sun sank, cast long, ominous shadows across the valleys, not from any specific evil that lived there. The Oklahoma Territory was to the west, while the White River was to the east. The breathtaking natural beauty of the area belied a gloom that few would ever comprehend. Families looking for seclusion and independence in the vast wilderness had established Devil's Den in the 1,830 seconds, according to Washington County records. It had not changed much by 1904. It was an area where neighbors lived far apart and were only connected by rudimentary dirt roads that were almost impassable in the wet season. Fayetteville, the closest sizable town, was about 30 miles to the northeast. It may take a day to travel there by wagon across the mountain routes. Although the seeds of what would later be known as the Devil's Den episode were sown years earlier, Eliza Thornwood's story starts on the 17th of April 1904. Eliza was the wife of Harold Thornwood, a well-known timber merchant who had amassed a small fortune by providing logs to the growing railroads that were slicing through the Ozarks, according to county records. Their house, a two-story dark wood building set against the backdrop of limestone bluffs, some 3 miles from what was supposedly the town center, stood out from the others. This instance is especially troubling, not only because of what occurred, but also because of how extensively it was recorded and then forgotten. Dr. James Calloway, a historian at the University of Arkansas, discovered a number of documents in 1964 while studying Ozark regional folklore. Among these were parts of Eliza's private journal, reports from the county sheriff, and notes from a medical examiner that had been partially destroyed. The documents were archived in the university's special collections after Dr. Calloway's research was unexpectedly defunded, according to his records. They were mostly forgotten until a microfilm copy was found in 1968 while renovating the library. In the neighborhood, the Thornwoods were regarded as modest yet dignified individuals. Harold's business activities introduced him to timber dealers and railroad authorities from as far away as Street Louis. Meanwhile, Eliza kept to herself. Dr. Calloway's research included interviews with former neighbors who described her as eccentric in her habits and educated beyond her station. She had apparently briefly worked as a nurse's assistant in Little Rock before to her marriage. Later on, this medical background would be important. The Thornwood property included about 40 acres of rocky and forested ground, according to Washington County land records. With 2 stories and a partially finished basement dug out of the limestone bedrock, the home itself was big by local standards. According to reports, Harold had created the house himself, adding a number of odd details that would later be the focus of conjecture. One of these, a fortified storage space next to his study, was known by the villagers as his private museum of geological specimens gathered over the years the Crawford mine was in operation. Although Harold and Eliza's marriage seemed normal on the surface, it was characterized by several oddities that their neighbors were aware of. By 1904, they had been married for 5 years, but they still had no children, which was a major source of conflict according to local reports. During one of his business trips to Little Rock in 1898, Harold met Eliza, who was 15 years her senior and a widower. Catherine, his first wife, had passed away in 1897 under somewhat odd circumstances. Although brain fever was given as the official explanation, there were persistent allegations that she had committed suicide. Harold's reputation in the community was unaffected, and these claims were never confirmed. Although it caused some controversy, his marriage to Eliza less than a year after Catherine's passing was widely seen as the sensible choice of a prosperous businessman in need of a domestic companion. It was still unclear what Eliza had been up to before she married Harold. According to the records, she was born Eliza Chamberlain in Springfield, Missouri in 1872. Her father was a pharmacist. She attended a women's seminary in Street Louis until 1892, receiving an education that was exceptionally comprehensive for a woman of her time. She had a brief job at a Little Rock hospital from 1892 and 1899 when she married Harold Thornwood. In an interview with Dr. Calloway in 1964, a colleague from this era characterized her as careful in her observations and especially adept at recording patient complaints. The level of information in Eliza's diary entries about her experiences at the Crawford mine may be explained by this training. Her descriptions point to a person who is used to taking accurate notes and is conversant with medical jargon. However, it's possible that this same accuracy played a part in her statements being written off as the product of an overly emotional mind. Her in-depth descriptions were just too amazing to be true. Mrs. Thornwood possesses an analytical mind and observational skills that would serve her well in the medical profession, were such opportunities more readily available to women, according to a 1,900 letter from Dr. Enigo. Richard Merriweather, the doctor Eliza had worked under in Little Rock. The letter was discovered among her personal belongings. During her time under my supervision, she demonstrated an exceptional ability to notice details others might overlook. Her documentation of patient conditions was invariably more thorough than that of her peers. Eliza informed Sheriff Thomas Blackwood that morning, in April of 1904, that she had seen something suspicious at the defunct Crawford mine, about a mile away from her home. In 1897, the mine was closed after 3 employees were killed in a fall. However, Eliza claimed to have seen individuals bringing odd equipment into the mine entrance at night and to have seen peculiar activity. During a brief phase of mining discovery in the Boston Mountains in 1881, the Crawford mine was developed. The Crawford enterprise never produced the substantial profits its investors had hoped for, yielding mostly low-grade limestone and small amounts of lead, in contrast to the more fruitful mining activities in other sections of Arkansas. It was thought that the home had been abandoned and the entrance had been partially blocked with timber bracing following the catastrophic fall in 1897. Sheriff Blackwood's report, dated April 18, 1904 evaluation. Mrs. Thornwood appears agitated and speaks at length about activities she claims to have witnessed at the old Crawford site. Her description lacks coherence, and her husband confirms she has been suffering from sleeplessness. No investigation warranted at this time. The report goes on to say, Mrs. Thornwood insists she observed a wagon arriving at the mine entrance shortly after midnight on April 16th. She claims to have seen 3 men unloading crates and what she described as medical apparatus into the mine. When questioned as to why she was abroad at such an hour, she stated she had been drawn from her bed by unusual sounds. Her account includes details that suggest a disturbed imagination rather than credible observation. The following is an excerpt from The frequency and severity of Eliza's assertions increased during the ensuing weeks. She visited his office at least 7 times between April and June, according to the sheriff's log. Her observations grew increasingly specific and, in the opinion of the authorities, increasingly unlikely. A letter written by Harold Thornwood to Sheriff Blackwood on May 3, 1904 begins with the following text. I must apologize for my wife's continued disruptions. The physician suggests her nervous condition stems from a female complaint, exacerbated by our inability to produce children. I assure you, I am seeking appropriate care for her condition. The letter goes on to make a worrying request. Should she appear at your office again, I would appreciate being notified immediately. Dr. Phillips advises against indulging her fantasies about the old mine, as it only serves to deepen her delusions. In confidence, I must tell you that her condition has reached a point where more stringent measures may soon become necessary. The way Eliza's testimony changes from describing suspicious activities to recording what she called proof of horrific practices is what makes this case so frightening. She started her own investigations in late May, visiting the mine site throughout the day to collect what she thought was proof, according to pieces of her diary that Dr. Calloway was able to retrieve. A diary entry from May 27 states, They believe me hysterical, but I know what I have seen. Today I collected samples from outside the mine entrance, soil with strange coloration, and an odor I recognize from my time assisting Dr. Merriweather in Little Rock. The material resembles that which appears when internal tissues are exposed to air for prolonged periods. I have preserved the samples in jars and hidden them beneath the floorboards of the root cellar. The diary becomes more and more disturbed in tone as Eliza's investigations continue. A later entry, dated May 29th, implies that Eliza's investigation went beyond simple observation. I followed the wagon tracks today. They lead not toward town, but to the old river crossing near Blackburn's farm. The ferry operator must be complicit. The tracks continue on the eastern shore toward Fayetteville. What are they transporting, and from where do they obtain their subjects? On the 2nd of June, she writes, I have been observing the mine entrance from the ridge above Simmons Creek. Using H's field glasses, I can see clearly without being detected. Today, a different wagon arrived, larger, with a canvas covering. 2 men I did not recognize unloaded what appeared to be a large wooden crate, but took both of them to carry it, suggesting considerable weight. They were inside for approximately 3 hours before emerging without the crate. What remains in that mine, and why must it be delivered under cover of darkness? Eliza and her husband's relationship had taken a serious turn for the worse by the beginning of June. In 1964, Martha Simmons, a neighbor, testified before Dr. Calloway, recalling, Mr. Thornwood started talking in whispers about his wife's condition. He called a specialist from Fort Smith to come and look at her. The day the doctor arrived, we could hear her protests from across the property. She didn't come out of the house for almost 2 weeks after. Mrs. Simmons added, my husband John met Harold at the general store during this time. Harold revealed that Eliza had developed an obsession with the old mine, saying it was being used for some kind of covert medical experiments. John didn't seem to care. The mine had been abandoned for years, as everyone knew. But later, John mentioned he had been hunting in that area and had indeed noticed fresh wagon tracks leading to the mine entrance. Harold became agitated at this information and abruptly ended the conversation. The doctor's note from this visit, signed by Dr. I.M. Edmund Phillips of Fort Smith, includes the following clinical evaluation. Patient exhibits signs of delusional paranoia, likely stemming from prolonged isolation and unfulfilled maternal instincts. Recommend regular doses of bromamide and a consideration of temporary placement in a suitable facility for women suffering from nervous conditions. The report goes on to say, patient insists she has witnessed clandestine activities at an abandoned mine near her residence. Her descriptions are elaborate, but bear the hallmarks of hysterical invention. Impossible medical procedures, mysterious substances, and conspiracies involving prominent members of the community. When confronted with the implausibility of her claims, she becomes increasingly agitated rather than reconsidering her position. This reinforces my diagnosis of a mind unmoored from rational thought. According to Dr. Calloway's investigation into Dr. Phillips's qualifications, he had attended a Chicago medical school for a brief time before to opening his Fort Smith practice in 1899. His area of expertise was identified as female nervous disorders, a general term frequently used to describe women who displayed conduct thought to be out of line with or problematic for the social mores of the day. The pivotal moment in this sinister story was what transpired next. Eliza apparently made the decision to collect indisputable proof rather than submit to treatment or incarceration. According to her journal, she waited until Harold had gone to sleep on the evening of June 18th before sneaking out of their house with a brownie camera that she had ordered from Sears, Roebuck & Company via mail. When Kodak released the brownie camera in 1900, it democratized photography by making it available to everyone, not just experts. Eliza most likely had a model that utilized 117 film and created two 1/4x 2/1/4 inch negatives, which were tiny but sufficiently clear to catch what she wanted to record. The entry from June 19th is especially disturbing. I positioned myself behind the limestone outcropping with a clear view of the mine entrance. At approximately 11:40, a wagon arrived without lanterns. 3 men unloaded what appeared to be medical equipment, similar to what I had seen in the surgical ward in Little Rock. A 4th man emerged from the mine. His clothes were stained dark. I exposed 4 plates before they departed near dawn. What they carried out was wrapped in oilcloth and roughly the size of a man. The entry continues with an unsettling observation. I recognized one of them, the tallest man, with the distinctive gait. It was Mr. Garrett, supposedly a timber buyer from Street Lewis. Harold has dined with him on 3 occasions since April. They are connected to this somehow. I must develop the plates immediately. According to county records, in the spring of 1904, a William Garrett, who was identified as a purchasing agent for the Street, Louis and San Francisco Railroad, also called the Frisco Line, visited the region multiple times. He had recorded conversations with Harold Thornwood and other nearby landowners, and his official mission was to acquire timber rights for railroad development. It is unknown what became of these photographic plates. The materials that Dr. Calloway found did not include them. The subsequent circumstances, however, imply that Eliza might have actually caught something important and hazardous. Harold Thornwood commissioned the construction of a tiny darkroom next to his study in 1902, presumably for processing photographs of geological specimens, according to a receipt found among his business files. This implies that even though he publicly rejected his wife's allegations, he might have known about or even participated in her documentation efforts. A different diary entry from June 20th poses additional concerns regarding Harold's involvement. H. discovered the exposed plates I had hidden in my sewing basket. He said nothing, merely looked at me with an expression I have never seen before, not anger, but calculation. He left immediately afterward, taking the plates with him. When he returned hours later, he behaved as if nothing had happened. The plates were not returned. I fear my position has become precarious. Harold Thornwood called Sheriff Blackwood on June 22nd to report his wife missing. He allegedly woke up to discover her side of the bed empty and her scarf and walking shoes gone, according to the story. After 2 days of searching the nearby forest, a search party was established, but produced no results. About 20 males from the neighborhood participated in the search for Eliza Thornwood. They mostly targeted the eastern ridges and the trail that led to the closest neighboring property, which was about 2 miles distant, according to Sheriff Blackwood's report. The Crawford Mine surroundings were conspicuously left out of the search limits, a decision that would subsequently cast doubt on the effort's thoroughness. Thomas Jackson, one of the men who took part in the search, gave Dr. Calloway the following account. In 1964, we were specifically instructed to avoid the western valley where the old mine was located. When I asked Sheriff Blackwood about this, he said the area had been searched privately by Mr. Thornwood himself and was deemed too dangerous for the rest of us due to the unstable mine entrance. I found this odd, as Mr. Thornwood was coordinating the eastern search with us and couldn't have searched the mine area simultaneously. Jackson added a detail that was not recorded in any official documents. During the second day of searching, one of the men, I believe it was young Robert Collins, mentioned he had seen smoke rising from the direction of the mine the previous evening. Sheriff Blackwood dismissed this as likely a campfire set by a hunter, but I remember Harold's face went pale at the mention. Nothing came of it, though. We never searched that area. 3 days after going missing on June 25, Eliza Thornwood made a reappearance at the Northwest Arkansas Times office in Fayetteville, which is about 30 miles from Devil's Den, rather than at her residence. She arrived in the afternoon, according to the newspaper logbook, and asked to talk to the editor regarding a public safety issue involving unlawful medical experiments. It would have been difficult for a lady to travel alone from Devil's Den to Fayetteville. Before arriving at the main road, the most direct approach required negotiating rough mountain routes. It's unknown how Eliza handled this journey. She was not known to have been transported by stagecoach or rail, indicating that she either walked a considerable distance or obtained unreported private transportation. Investigators were then informed by a newspaper office clerk that Eliza had brought a little leather purse with her, which she kept very safe. Although the contents of this satchel were never formally recorded, there is conjecture that it might have held the photographic plates or other pieces of evidence she had collected. No later accounts concerning her return to Devil's Den mention the satchel. Rebecca Wilson, the newspaper clerk, gave this account to Dr. Calloway as follows. Mrs. Thornwood was composed but urgent in her manner. She insisted on speaking only with Mr. Simmons and waited nearly an hour for his return from lunch. When they spoke, it was behind closed doors. for approximately 40 minutes. When they emerged, Mr. Simmons looked pale. He immediately sent a telegraph to someone, I assumed the authorities. Mrs. Thornwood sat quietly in the waiting area until her husband arrived. She did not protest when he took her arm to lead her out, but she left the satchel with Mr. Simmons, saying only, "Keep it safe until we speak again." Her conversation with James Simmons, the newspaper's editor, is undocumented, but the publication never ran a piece about her allegations. However, it is recorded that by evening, Harold Thornwood and the county sheriff had been informed of her whereabouts. Harold got there just before 6 p.m. to pick up his wife. Dr. Calloway discovered telegraph records from the Fayetteville office that indicate James Simmons sent 2 messages that afternoon. The first merely informed Sheriff Blackwood of Eliza's presence and was addressed to him, but the second was submitted to the State Medical Society in Little Rock to a Dr. Raymond Finch. Although the contents of this telegraph have never been found, further developments imply that it might have been connected to the details Eliza had provided. Eliza's journal entries, which imply she was essentially confined to her home, are used to piece together what transpired over the course of the following 2 weeks. A July 3rd entry states, H has removed the door to my room and disposed of my outdoor clothing. Dr. P visits daily to administer the tincture that makes my thoughts cloudy. They have taken my samples and photographic plates. When I mentioned the newspaper, H informed me that Editor Simmons understands the importance of not publishing hysterical claims that would damage the reputation of prominent businessmen. Another entry from July 5th grows more and more paranoid. They speak in hushed voices outside my door. I have heard unfamiliar voices, men who are not from here. They believe I sleep, but the doses have become less effective. I am remembering to appear sedated while remaining alert. There was mention of relocation and the facility. I believe they intend to move me elsewhere. The paragraph continues. Last night I heard H arguing with someone, a man whose voice I did not recognize. The man said, "The situation has become untenable. She has spoken to the newspaper." H replied, "Simmons has been handled. There will be no story." Then the man said something that chilled me to the bone. The work at the mine is too important to risk exposure. The advances we've made cannot be compromised by one woman's hysteria. What are they doing in that mine, and why are they so determined to silence me? On July 7th, the most disturbing entry states, I recognized one of them today. The man who came to administer my medication was the same man I photographed entering the mine on the night of June 18th. He smiled when he saw the recognition in my eyes. The man's identity has never been confirmed. But Dr. Calloway's investigation turned up a potential contender. Dr. Walter Kingsley came to the region in late June 1904, supposedly to research local illnesses. According to his qualifications, he was affiliated with a medical research institute in Philadelphia. But Dr. Calloway's follow-up investigations revealed no evidence of such an institution's existence. Purchases made at a nearby pharmacy and Fayetteville motel registers attest to Dr. Kingsley's presence in the region. According to these documents, he left the area soon after the Thornwood home fire and stayed until the middle of July. Dr. Kingsley's photograph has never been found. Furthermore, his contacts with either of the Thornwoods are not officially documented. A final diary entry, dated July the 10th, suggests Eliza had begun to lose hope. I understand now that what I have witnessed will never be believed. The truth exists in a place beyond my reach. They have constructed a narrative in which I am already dead. My words, the product of a disturbed mind. My evidence dismissed as fabrication. Perhaps in another time, someone will hear my voice through these pages. If these words are found, know this. What happens in the Crawford mine violates all natural law and human decency. They seek to extend what should not be extended, to preserve what should naturally decay. The techniques they develop there will eventually reach beyond our mountains, into hospitals and battlefields where life and death are daily commodities. The entry concludes with a particularly disturbing observation. Last night, I heard a sound I recognized from my time in the hospital, the unmistakable whir of a bone saw. It came not from the mine, but from H's study below. What, or who, is he dissecting in our home? I have barricaded my door as best I can, but I fear it will not hold for long. The Thornwood home was the scene of a fire on the 12th of July, 1904. The building was completely enveloped by the time neighbors came to help. According to reports, Harold Thornwood was severely burned while trying to save his wife, who was allegedly sedated in a bedroom upstairs. 3 days later, he passed away at Washington County Hospital in Fayetteville from his wounds. Although a body believed to be Eliza's was found among the wreckage, her bones were never positively identified according to the coroner's report. The basement level of the house, more precisely the location where Eliza had indicated concealing her samples in the root cellar, was found to be the source of the fire. The fire inspector's report states that the fire spread unusually quickly, which may indicate the presence of accelerants. Later, this conclusion was changed to credit the quick spread to a very dry summer and the wooden construction of the house. Dr. Calloway was given this account by Thomas Cravens, one of the neighbors who responded to the fire. By the time we arrived, the lower floor was completely consumed. Harold was outside, badly burned. He kept pointing to an upstairs window, saying Eliza was still inside. Several of us tried to enter, but the heat was unbearable. The entire structure collapsed within 20 minutes, faster than any house fire I've ever witnessed. Cravens added a detail that was not included in any official reports. The strange thing was, Harold didn't come from the house when we arrived. He emerged from the tree line to the west, as if he'd been returning to the property when the fire broke out. Yet, he was badly burned, his clothing singed. It never made sense to me how he could have been injured by the fire if he wasn't in the house when it started. Sarah Jenkins, a different neighbor, recounted a strange incident conversation with Dr. Calloway. When we arrived at the Thornwood place that night, I noticed something peculiar. Despite the chaos and the flames, there was a wagon already hitched and loaded with several trunks and crates at the edge of the property. It seemed as if someone had been preparing to depart before the fire began. In the confusion that followed, I forgot about it until much later. By morning, the wagon was gone. However, if not for what transpired next, the situation might have stopped there. A devastating house fire that claimed 2 lives. 3 males connected to the Thornwood case passed away in the weeks after the fire for reasons that were strange in hindsight but prompted little inquiries at the time. It appears that Dr. Edmund Phillips overdosed on morphine for himself, as he was discovered dead in his Fort Smith office. Officially, a fall in the unstable structure was the cause of Sheriff Thomas Blackwood's deadly accident as he was investigating the abandoned Crawford mine. Additionally, while fishing on the White River, James Simmons, editor of the Northwest Arkansas Times, perished. Officials at the time considered these fatalities, which happened within about 3 weeks of one another, as unrelated tragedies. The link between these guys and the Thornwood case was only discovered 60 years later thanks to Dr. Calloway's investigation. At best, the inquiry into the Thornwood house fire was superficial. According to the county fire inspector's report, the fire was caused by a kerosene lamp mishap, although the deceased woman's mental state might have played a role in her negligence with open flames. The bizarre occurrences in Devil's Den were buried for almost half a century, both literally and figuratively. Then, in 1963, as part of his study of Ozark folklore, Dr. James Calloway started gathering oral histories from senior citizens in Washington County. A number of these interviews mentioned the woman who saw too much and the doctors at the mine. Dr. Calloway became intrigued and continued his investigation, finally discovering the disjointed records that serve as the foundation for this story. According to his notes, he had a special interest in Crawford mining property documents. He learned that the abandoned property had been covertly acquired by a corporate entity known as Northwestern Medical Research Association in March 1904, a month before Eliza initially reported suspicious behavior. After some research, it was discovered that this organization was not formally associated with any accredited medical facility, but Dr. Calloway discovered letters indicating ties to several doctors who had been dismissed by the American Medical Association for unethical experimental practices. The nature of these experiments is still up for debate, but Dr. Calloway wrote in a letter to a colleague in September 1963. The more I investigate the Thornwood case, the more convinced I am that something truly disturbing occurred in Devil's Den in 1904. The systematic elimination of witnesses, the purchase of the mine by a shell organization, the convenient fire that destroyed both Eliza and her evidence, all point to a coordinated effort to conceal activities that violated ethical and likely legal boundaries of the era. Oblique allusions to preservation and surgical procedures that Eliza found unsettling can be found throughout her diaries. Some historians have speculated that the Crawford mine may have been used for early experiments in tissue preservation or surgical techniques too controversial to be carried out in established medical facilities. She writes in one particularly cryptic entry, "They seek to extend what should not be extended. The natural order disrupted by men who believe themselves beyond God's limitations." Medical technology advanced quickly in the early 1900s, but there was also little ethical supervision during this time. When Dr. Calloway's funding was abruptly stopped in 1964, his study came to a complete stop. Based on his private letters, he thought this was directly connected to his investigations into the Northwestern Medical Research Association, which he had learned had ties to a number of notable families in the area. In a the 12th of November 1964 letter to Dr. Calloway, the university administration sent the following succinct notice. "The committee has examined your present research program and concluded that funds would be better spent on projects of more substantial historical merit. Your study of rural folklore, and in particular the so-called Devil's Den incident, is considered to be too academic in character and not likely to make a significant contribution to historical scholarship. We advise you to direct your efforts toward more fruitful lines of inquiry." Dr. Calloway's handwritten note on the letter simply states, "They've been reached. Someone still cares very much about what happened in it mine." The Crawford mine itself collapsed completely in 1957 after heavy spring rains, burying whatever secrets it may have contained. Dr. Calloway wrote in his final notes on the subject, "What happened to Eliza Thornwood represents more than a personal tragedy. It speaks to the vulnerability of truth when confronted with power." Her voice was systematically silenced, first dismissed as hysteria, then physically contained, and finally extinguished altogether. The men she accused suffered convenient deaths shortly after hers, suggesting her claims may have carried more weight than history has acknowledged. Only the stone foundation remains as proof of the Thornwood house's existence. The forest has since reclaimed the space where it once stood. The microfilmed records of Dr. Calloway's Devil's Den research were found in 1968 by a doctoral student who was helping to classify his papers after his death. After a quick review, these records were placed in the university's special collections. The sole time they were checked out, according to library records, was in 1969 by a researcher whose name has been removed from the log. The potential that Eliza Thornwood discovered real atrocities is only one aspect of the case that is extremely unsettling. Another is the deliberate discrediting and final erasure of her findings. Truth was buried with her because of a confluence of factors, including her gender, the time period's views on women's mental health, and the social status of the people she charged. Her diary bits that have survived indicate that she was well aware of her vulnerability. In what may have been her last entry, dated July 10, 1904, she wrote the following: "I understand now that what I have witnessed will never be believed. The truth exists in a place beyond my reach. They have constructed a narrative in which I am already dead. My words, the product of a disturbed mind. My evidence dismissed as fabrication." Perhaps in another time, someone will hear my voice through these pages. An elderly local resident who had been a young boy in 1904 gave this account in 1967 as part of an oral history project unrelated to Dr. Calloway's research. "My father was among those who searched for Mrs. Thornwood when she was reported missing. He told me years later that the search had been deliberately misdirected. The sheriff had them combing the eastern ridges even though a local hunter had reported seeing smoke from the old mine in the Western Valley. My father always believed they weren't meant to find her, at least not while she might still speak. For decades, Eliza Thornwood's story was reduced to a whispered legend among the oldest residents of Washington County, the woman who saw too much. Another local account recorded in 1965 comes from a woman who had worked briefly as a housemaid for the Thornwoods in early 1904. Mrs. Thornwood had a precise mind. She kept detailed records of everything: household accounts, weather patterns, wildlife sightings, not the actions of someone prone to fantasy or confusion. What always stayed with me was how her manner changed after she began watching the mine. It wasn't fear I saw in her eyes. It was certainty. The woman continued. There was tension in that house long before Mrs. Thornwood began making her claims about the mine. I noticed Mr. Thornwood would often receive visitors late in the evening, men who never came through the front door but would be seated in his study when I brought coffee. They spoke in hushed tones, and the conversations would cease immediately when I entered. Once, I overheard mention of progress despite limitations, and specimens requiring special handling. I assumed they were discussing his timber business, but, in retrospect, I wonder. The case's tangible evidence has mostly disappeared. Eliza never found the samples she said she had taken from outside the mine. She exposed the photographic plate on the evening of June 18th, but it has never been found. The majority of residents can no longer identify the original position of the Crawford mine since nature has reclaimed the land. What Eliza Thornwood saw that night in June 1904 is one of the unanswered riddles that have persisted for almost a century. Why were people involved in the case effectively silenced? Most troubling of all, what was being done in that defunct mine that needed such protection and secrecy? The Thornwood residence's architectural drawings, which have been maintained in county records, provide an intriguing element that was left out of the official reports. Next to Harold's study, the house had a specifically built darkroom that was used to prepare photographic plates. This implies that Harold Thornwood might have been aware of, or even helped in, his wife's documentation efforts, even if he publicly rejected her assertions. Dr. Calloway's review of Harold Thornwood's company records revealed another oddity. 2 months before Eliza first reported activity at the mine, in February 1904, Harold had placed an order for a large number of chemicals often used in specimen preservation and photography. Formaldehyde, silver nitrate, and a number of other substances that had no apparent connection to the timber industry were included on the invoice from a St. Louis pharmaceutical supply company. 3 days after the fire, on the 15th of July 1904, a newspaper clipping from the Northwest Arkansas Times featured the following brief obituary. Harold Thornwood, age 42, successful businessman and respected member of the community, succumbed to injuries sustained while heroically attempting to save his wife from their burning home. He is survived by his brother, Dr. Wilson Thornwood of St. Louis. No prior reference to this brother can be found in any local records, and Dr. Calloway's subsequent research did not turn up any doctors with that name working in St. Louis at the time. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery among Dr. Calloway's papers is a partial transcript of an interview conducted in 1964 with an elderly man identified only as a former employee, Crawford mining operation. The man, who would have been in his 82nd at the time of the interview, provided this account. Those of us who worked the day shifts were told the night operations were related to testing new drilling techniques. But we noticed things. Equipment that had no place in a mining operation. Unusual waste that had to be disposed of. Most concerning were the shipments that arrived labeled as mining chemicals but were addressed to doctors, not mining engineers. After the collapse in '97, I thought it was finished. Then, in '04, I heard they had reopened portions of the mine, not for extracting ore, for something else. The interview abruptly ends mid-sentence with a notation from Dr. Calloway that the interview subject refused to continue and asked that his comments be stricken from the record. When a locked records room with medical records from the early 1900s was discovered during renovations at the Washington County Hospital in 1969, it provided the last piece of this unsettling puzzle. These included a 1,904 partial patient record with an entry from July 12, the day of the Thornwood fire. A patient named Jane Smith is listed as having been admitted with a note, extensive burns, transferred from Devil's Den area. W is listed as the attending physician, Thornwood. For this patient, no discharge date has been entered. Rather, a single word is scribbled in the margin: relocated. The handwriting is similar to those found in reports filed by Sheriff Thomas Blackwood. In reality, was Jane Smith Eliza Thornwood? Had the very individuals she had accused spirited her away after she had escaped the fire? The documents offer no conclusive response, but another troubling possibility in a case characterized by missing evidence and government reticence. A retired nurse who had worked at Washington County Hospital in the early 1900s provided this account to researchers in 1968. I remember the burn patient from the Devil's Den fire. She was kept in a private room at the end of the East Wing, with a guard posted, unusual for any patient. We were told she was severely disfigured and sensitive to visitors. Only one doctor was permitted to treat her, an outside specialist, not one of our regular staff. After about a week, I arrived for my shift to find her room empty. When I inquired, the head nurse said only that the patient had been transferred to a specialized facility. No paperwork was processed through the normal channels. The nurse, who requested anonymity even in the 1968 interview, added this disturbing detail: "I saw her only once, when I was called to assist with changing bandages." Her burns were indeed severe, but what struck me was her eyes, fully alert and filled with what I can only describe as desperate awareness. She tried to speak to me when the doctor stepped out, but her voice was barely audible. All I could make out was not my husband, not his brother. Before she could say more, the doctor returned. I was never assigned to her again. Another intriguing link was found by the graduate student who first learned about Dr. Calloway's work in 1968. In late July 1904, a new patient with severe burn injuries was admitted to a private sanitarium known as the Westbrook Institute for Nervous Disorders, according to St. Louis hospital records. The patient, who was only known as E.T., stayed at the hospital until 1912, when it closed. It is unknown what happened to this patient in the future. Business records indicate that the Westbrook Institute was founded in 1899 with the support of a number of well-known doctors and businessmen, including a sizable investment from a lumber consortium that had ties to Harold Thornwood's business partners. The institute treated women with a variety of hysteria and nervous fatigue diagnoses, which were popular catch-alls for women who behaved in ways that were considered improper or contrary to the social mores of the time. A former orderly at the Westbrook Institute, who was interviewed in 1968, stated, "There was a patient on the third floor who was kept separate from the others. The staff called her the Burned Lady. Her face and hands were badly scarred, and she spoke very little. What was unusual was that she received regular visits from men who didn't seem like family, more like doctors or businessmen. They would spend hours with her, often bringing unusual equipment. We were told she was part of an experimental treatment program for burn recovery." Dr. Calloway wrote this final note in 1968, just before his research materials were archived. The story of Eliza Thornwood is not merely a historical curiosity, but a warning. When power collides with truth, it is rarely truth that survives intact. What happened in Devil's Den in 1904 was systematically erased, first through discrediting a witness, then through the convenient deaths of all involved, and finally through the physical destruction of evidence. What remains is a void in the historical record, a silence where a woman's testimony should be. The area where Devil's Den once stood is now mostly covered by Lake Fort Smith, which was formed by damming the Frog Bayou in the 1,950 seconds. The surrounding ridge's highest points, such as the limestone bluffs close to the Thornwood home, are still above water and can only be reached by boat. When passing specific locations on the lake after sunset, local fishermen sometimes notice an odd occurrence. Electrical devices, such as radios, depth finders, and even battery-operated lights, suddenly malfunction before functioning normally again. The reason for this, according to engineers, is that mineral deposits in the underwater terrain disrupt electrical impulses. However, some elderly locals provide an alternative explanation. They contend that the disruption caused by Eliza Thornwood's observations and the actions of those men in that abandoned mine goes beyond the actual remains that are currently submerged in the sea. Eliza herself could have called it a ripple in the natural order. In 1965, Dr. Calloway's research was given a troubling backdrop by a retired Fayetteville doctor. The doctor, who requested anonymity in the records, stated, "During my medical training in Philadelphia in 1908, I encountered references to experimental preservation techniques developed in a rural research facility in the Ozarks. The procedures involved methods for maintaining tissue viability outside the living body for extended periods, far beyond what was publicly known to be possible at that time. These techniques later formed the foundation for advances in organ preservation that became standard by the 1,940 seconds. The origin of this research was never properly attributed in medical literature, but those who knew spoke of it as the Arkansas method. I always wondered what price was paid for that knowledge." The physician continued, "There were rumors among certain circles of experimental surgeries performed on unwilling subjects, individuals who wouldn't be missed or whose disappearances could be explained away, the rural poor, the mentally ill, vagrants passing through remote areas. I dismissed these stories as ghoulish exaggerations until I encountered a colleague who had supposedly participated in the research. He was drunk one evening and began rambling about a mine in the Ozarks, where they had conquered temporary death. He claimed they had discovered methods to maintain cellular viability in severed limbs for days rather than hours, an impossibility, according to the medical understanding of the time. When I pressed him for details the next day, he denied the entire conversation and avoided me thereafter." Dr. Calloway also found a partial inventory record from the Crawford mine in May 1904, which was another interesting document. The list contained goods more frequently found in a medical institution, such as surgical tools, chemical preservatives, specialist glassware, and electrical equipment of uncertain purpose. In contrast to normal mining equipment, the document is signed by a Dr. W.T., who may be the enigmatic Eliza Thornwood who was referenced in Harold's obituary, and it is on the letterhead of the Northwestern Medical Research Association. The Crawford mine had unique characteristics that set it apart from other nearby mining operations, according to a geologist who examined the area in the 1,950 seconds before Lake Fort Smith was established. He wrote in his report, "The excavation appears to have been conducted with purpose beyond mere mineral extraction. Several chambers have been carefully enlarged and reinforced with evidence of wooden flooring and electrical wiring installation, unusual features for a mine of this era and purpose. Of particular note is a large central chamber, approximately 200 feet from the entrance, which appears to have been specifically designed as a workspace rather than for mining operations. Without further historical context, it is difficult to determine the purpose of these modifications. It's unlikely that the whole truth regarding what transpired at Devil's Den in 1904 will ever be known. The terrain itself has changed, the principals are long deceased, and the evidence has been dispersed or destroyed. What remains is a disjointed story, a compilation of records, testimony, and glaring omissions that suggest a sinister core to the Boston Mountains." In a private email, Dr. Calloway wrote, "I have come to believe that Eliza Thornwood's greatest transgression was not that she saw too much, but that she refused to unsee it. In an age when women were expected to doubt their own perceptions, when contradicted by men of authority, she maintained a fatal certainty. She knew what she had witnessed, and she was determined to make others see it too." The notion that Eliza Thornwood survived the fire only to be used as a test subject for the very operation she had aimed to expose is perhaps more unsettling than the possibility that she perished in it. A story much more horrific than a straightforward silencing by death is hinted at by the patient registry record, the enigmatic Jane Smith with burns, and the relocated patient at the Westbrook Institute. Dr. Calloway got an anonymous letter from Street Louis that was stamped in 1964 when he was doing his inquiry. "The woman who saw too much still sees, though her eyes are clouded now. They kept her alive to perfect their methods. What you seek lies beneath the waters now, but some secrets never truly drown." The letter was signed simply, "A friend from Westbrook." Efforts to identify the sender were unsuccessful. The remains of Devil's Den are now covered by still Lake Fort Smith waters. Paddling across its surface, tourists are oblivious to what might lurk beneath. The Thornwood home, the Crawford mine, and the routes Eliza took to collect her evidence have all been removed from the landscape and are now only preserved in jumbled records and dim memories. However, the fragmented documents that survive the methodical erasing of Eliza Thornwood's story might still contain some of her reality. History has shown her to be correct and incorrect, yet her voice, so completely hushed in 1904, still echoes from the pages of her diary. I understand now that what I have witnessed will never be believed. Her evidence was dismissed by her peers as the result of feminine weakness and hysteria, and they did not believe her. However, the tidbits of her story have endured over the years, implying that what she saw in that deserted mine was genuine enough to justify her silence. An elderly woman in Fayetteville gave a collection of her personal belongings to the Washington County Historical Society in 1967, providing the last piece of proof. James Simmons, the newspaper editor who drowned soon after meeting Eliza Thornwood, had a leather-bound notebook among them. His widow, who never remarried and kept his possessions undamaged until her death, had saved the journal. A single entry, dated June 25, 1904, the day of his meeting with Eliza, contains this cryptic note: Mrs. T. Brought evidence today that, if authentic, would implicate several prominent men in activities beyond the bounds of ethical medicine or natural law. The photographs are unclear but disturbing. Surgical apparatus in a setting that is clearly not a proper medical facility, and what appears to be preserved human tissues. She claims they are attempting to extend the viability of organs outside the body using techniques that violate all known medical ethics. I have secured the materials in the newspaper safe until I can verify her claims. If true, this represents not just a local scandal, but a matter that may require federal attention. No further entries appear in the journal. Within 3 weeks, Simmons drowned. His replacement allegedly emptied the newspaper safe. Furthermore, there is no documentation of the fate of the materials that Eliza gave him. The latter career of Harold's alleged brother, Dr. Wilson Thornwood, is an interesting postscript to this story. Although Dr. Calloway was unable to locate any documentation of a doctor with that name working in St. Louis in the early 1900s, his investigation did turn up mentions of a doctor, William Thornton, who starting in 1908 became a trailblazer in tissue preservation methods. Before vanishing from medical literature in 1915, Dr. Thornton wrote a number of important publications on the topic. After this time, his whereabouts are unknown. The advances described herein represent the culmination of experiments conducted over many years in isolated conditions necessary for uninterrupted research. Dr. Thornton's 1910 paper, which was published in a small medical journal, makes this telling statement. The techniques for extending tissue viability were perfected through trial and error in circumstances that afforded complete privacy and freedom from conventional constraints. A final, terrifying piece to the puzzle was supplied by a former patient at the Westbrook Institute in 1968. The woman who had received nervous exhaustion treatment in 1911 stated, "There was a patient there who never mixed with the rest of us, a woman with severe burn scars." The staff called her the special case. One night I became disoriented and entered the wrong wing of the building. I saw her sitting by a window, writing in a journal. When she noticed me, she beckoned me closer and whispered, "I am Eliza Thornwood. Remember that name." Before I could respond, an orderly appeared and escorted me back to my room. The next day, the woman was gone. When I asked about her, I was told there had never been a patient in that room. This may ultimately be the most unsettling element of the Devil's Den incident: how well it was buried, not what transpired in 1904, how totally the testimony of a woman might be discredited. Her proof was destroyed. Her whole existence was all but forgotten. Thornwood, Eliza, witnessed too much. Until it was too late, no one took her seriously. And maybe it's still too late in some manner. Layers of water, time, and willful forgetting covered the truth. There are no records of the Northwestern Medical Research Association's operations after 1904. The only questions that remained after it disintegrated as silently as it had created were what experiments might have been carried out in that defunct mine and what knowledge might have been acquired at the expense of unidentified individuals. Days before his funding was slashed, Dr. Calloway wrote this final note about his research. I have been advised by university administration to pursue other research interests. My inquiries about Northwestern Medical Research Association appear to have touched nerves in unexpected places. Perhaps some secrets are still protected, even after 60 years. Perhaps some truths remain dangerous long after those who first concealed them have passed away. Some things, perhaps, are better left unseen. But Eliza Thornwood didn't have that luxury. She saw, and she spoke, and she paid the ultimate price for her refusal to remain silent. And the remains of the Crawford mine remain hidden, someplace beneath those waters.